The wind was dry that morning, carrying a thin layer of dust across the wide, empty land. Caleb stood on the porch of his small wooden ranch house, staring at the horizon. His 2 children, a boy and a girl, were still inside, curled up on a thin bed, holding each other the way children do when they don't fully understand the world. It had been almost 2 winters since their mother passed away from fever, but some mornings it still felt like yesterday. The house was too quiet without her laughter, the kitchen too cold, and the nights too long. Caleb wasn't a man who spoke many words, but inside him was a silence that felt heavier than the earth. He worked the land alone, fixing fences, caring for a few cows, and trying to grow enough hay to survive. He woke up before the sun and went to sleep after the stars came out. Some days he carried his children on the wagon to the river, just so they could feel something other than loneliness. He wasn't a man who complained, but he knew the truth. A ranch without helping hands was like a fire without wood. It would soon go out. He needed someone, not just to help with work, but to bring warmth back into the house. One day, Caleb rode into town with the little money he had saved over the last months. He needed supplies: flour, salt, a small bag of coffee, and maybe some cloth for his daughter's worn-out dress. The town was a busy place that morning. Wagons rolled in, horses kicked the ground, and men with dusty hats stood outside the trading post talking loudly. Caleb didn't pay much attention to their words at first, but then he caught something that made him stop. "They got 3 Apache women over at the back of the post," one man whispered to another. "Can't keep them here for long. Ain't no use for them." Another laughed, careless and loud. $6 for all 3. That's what the trader's asking. Like trading mules. Caleb's hand froze on the saddle strap. He didn't like the way the men talked. They said the words as if those women weren't even people. But behind their cruel tone, he heard something else. 3 young women, alone, with nowhere to go. He thought of his children. He thought of the cold nights. He thought of his house that no longer felt like a home. He didn't need servants. He needed kindness in the house again. He needed someone who could keep the children from growing up with nothing but silence. The trading post was a rough wooden building with a long porch. Behind it, near the corral, stood 3 Apache women. They were young, wrapped in thin cloth, their hair long and dark. They didn't speak. Their faces were calm, but their eyes were watchful, like people who have seen too much and trust no one. Caleb walked closer, his boots crunching in the dirt. One of the women looked up and met his eyes for a moment. It wasn't fear he saw. It was strength. Quiet strength. The trader, a round man with a red face, leaned on a barrel and waved his hand at Caleb. "You looking to buy?" he said with a grin. $6. All 3. I got no use for them. You can take them off my hands." Caleb didn't like this man. He didn't like his grin. He didn't like the way he pointed at them, like pointing at horses. But Caleb wasn't here to argue. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the $6 he had saved. It was almost everything he had, the money he needed for winter. He placed it on the barrel slowly. "I got children," he said quietly. "They need a mother. They need someone in the house. I'll take them." The trader didn't care about his reasons. He just grabbed the money, nodded, and walked away. Caleb turned back to the women. They didn't move. They didn't know what to think of this quiet man with a weathered face and kind but tired eyes. He didn't grab them or shout. He just waited. He nodded toward the wagon. "I got a place," he said softly. "Not much, but it's safe." For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the oldest of the 3 women stepped forward. The other 2 followed. They climbed into the wagon without a word. Caleb guided the horse forward, the wheels creaking on the dirt road as the town slowly disappeared behind them. The ride was long and silent. He didn't look back at them much. He didn't want them to feel trapped. He just drove home, hands tight on the reins, mindful of questions he couldn't answer yet. The sun was falling low when they reached the ranch. His children stood at the doorway, holding each other. They were small and unsure. The wagon stopped in front of the house, and the Apache women stepped down carefully, their bare feet touching the dry earth. The boy hid behind the doorframe, but the girl, curious, took a step forward. She looked at them not like strangers, but like someone who had been waiting for someone to return. The oldest woman bent down a little and gave a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign of warmth that had touched the house in a long time. Caleb showed them the small rooms, the kitchen, the barn. He spoke in simple words and gentle gestures. They didn't speak English well, but they understood enough. He made it clear they were free to walk anywhere on the land. He didn't lock doors. He didn't make demands. He only asked that they share the roof and help keep the children safe. He cooked a simple supper that night, beans, bread, and boiled coffee, and they all sat around the small wooden table. No one talked, but something quiet passed between them. A beginning. That night after the children had gone to bed, Caleb sat outside under the stars. The land stretched out quiet around him. He heard the soft voices of the three women inside the house, talking to each other in their own language. Their voices were low but gentle, like wind moving through tall grass. It was the first time in years the house sounded alive. The next morning, when the sun rose over the hills, Caleb went out to the barn as usual. But this time, when he opened the door, the women were already there. One was feeding the chickens, another was carrying water, and the third was mending a broken basket. They didn't wait for instructions. They moved like people who understood hard work because they had lived it all their lives. Caleb stood quietly for a moment, then tipped his hat. He didn't need to say thank you out loud. They understood. The children slowly grew more comfortable. The boy followed one of the women around the corral, watching her braid the horse's mane. The girl sat in the kitchen while another woman showed her how to weave a small bracelet. Caleb felt something stir inside him that had been missing since his wife passed away. It wasn't love. Not yet, it was hope. Hope that maybe the house could be filled with warmth again. Hope that his children might grow up knowing kindness, not just loneliness. But not everything was easy. At night, when the house grew quiet, he could see in their eyes the weight they carried. They were not like people who had chosen to come. They had lost something too: families, land, trust. Caleb didn't try to take that away. He didn't ask them to forget. He just tried to make the place gentle enough that they wouldn't have to fear it. As the days passed, small things began to change. The house smelled like fresh bread again. The children laughed in the yard. The chickens clucked loudly, and the wind carried not just silence but voices. Caleb still worked the fields, but when he came home now, someone was there to greet him. Not with loud words, but with quiet eyes that didn't feel like strangers anymore. One night, as the fire crackled softly, Caleb sat at the table while the children fell asleep near the hearth. The three women sat across from him, their faces glowing in the warm light. They didn't share the same language, but for the first time, they didn't need to. Something unspoken had begun to form in that house. Not a perfect family, but a place where broken people found a bit of safety. Caleb looked at his children sleeping, then at the three women who had walked into his life on a quiet afternoon for $6. He didn't see a bargain. He saw a chance, and deep inside he hoped the land would one day call them family. The months passed slowly and the ranch began to feel alive again. Caleb's house was no longer filled with silence. Every morning, when the sun climbed over the hills, he heard the soft sounds of the three Apache women working around the ranch. One chopped wood, another cooked over the fire, and the third helped Caleb mend fences and feed the animals. They never needed to be told what to do. They just did it, quietly and steadily, the way people who had known hard work their whole lives moved through each day. Caleb's children grew closer to them without even realizing it. The boy followed the oldest woman everywhere, asking questions in his little voice even though she didn't understand all of his words. She would smile, pat his shoulder, and keep working. The little girl spent most of her time with the youngest woman, who had gentle hands and a warm smile. She taught the girl how to braid strands of grass and make small bracelets. Soon, the child wore one around her wrist every day like a small treasure. Caleb kept his distance at first. He gave them their space and their freedom. He didn't want them to feel trapped or owned. He saw the way they sometimes looked at the horizon at sunset, their eyes distant as if remembering something far away. He never asked questions. He just made sure they had food, shelter, and safety. Slowly, trust began to grow, not through big promises but through quiet, everyday moments. One cold night, the wind howled across the plains, rattling the shutters of the house. The little boy started coughing, and soon his forehead grew hot. Caleb froze for a moment. The same thing had happened to his wife before she died. He still remembered those nights, the long, helpless hours when the fever grew worse and he could do nothing. His hands shook as he carried his son to the small bed near the fire. The Apache women quickly came to help. The oldest woman felt the boy's forehead, then looked at Caleb with calm, steady eyes. She moved quickly, pulling out a small pouch she always carried with her. It was filled with herbs she had gathered from the land. One of the women boiled water, another ground the herbs, and they worked silently, like they had done this many times before. Caleb knelt beside them, feeling a strange mix of fear and hope. Through the long night, they took turns wiping the boy's forehead with a wet cloth and making him drink small sips of warm herbal water. The fire flickered, casting soft light on their faces. Caleb could hear their quiet voices speaking in their language, a gentle rhythm that seemed to calm the air around them. He sat beside his son, holding the small hand in his rough, calloused one, praying silently. When the first light of morning came through the window, the boy's breathing was easier. The fever was gone. He opened his eyes, weak but smiling. Caleb felt something heavy lift from his heart. He turned to the women who were sitting near the fire, tired but still alert. He didn't have many words, but he nodded slowly. His eyes said everything he couldn't say aloud. They nodded back. From that moment, something changed. The days that followed were different. The children no longer saw the women as strangers. They clung to them like they belonged. The women began to teach them small things, songs in their language, how to pick certain plants, how to listen to the sound of the wind. Caleb saw his daughter laughing again, a sound he had missed for too long. He saw his son running in the yard, chasing a chicken with the youngest woman laughing softly in the background. The ranch began to grow stronger. The garden flourished. The animals were healthier. Caleb had never been good with planting, but the middle woman had a way of making things grow. She showed him how to place seeds in certain patterns, how to water carefully, how to keep pests away with simple tricks from her people. Soon, green shoots covered the dry earth, and Caleb found himself amazed at how much life could come from so little. One evening, after a long day of work, Caleb sat on the porch as the sun melted into the hills. The three women were sitting nearby with the children. The oldest woman was brushing the girl's hair gently. The middle woman was weaving something from thin strips of leather, and the youngest was humming a quiet tune. Caleb felt something warm in his chest. This was not the house he had known 2 winters ago. This was something new, something alive. Of course, the world outside wasn't kind. People in town began to talk. Whispers traveled quickly in a small place. Some called him foolish. Some called him strange. They didn't understand. But Caleb didn't care about their whispers. He cared about what happened within the wooden walls of his ranch. Inside there was kindness. Inside there was peace. One afternoon, men from the town rode up to the ranch. They wanted to know why Caleb had kept the Apache women. Their words were cold, their faces hard. But Caleb stood tall, his hat pulled low, his voice calm. He didn't shout. He simply said, "This is my home. My children are safe here, and so are they." The men rode away, muttering under their breath, but they didn't come back. The seasons changed again. Spring brought wildflowers that covered the hills in yellow and white. The ranch became known for its strong harvest. People who had once whispered now watched from afar with quiet surprise. Caleb's children grew taller, healthier, and happier. They no longer cried at night. They no longer feared the quiet. The bond between Caleb and the three women grew too, not with grand gestures, but through shared days and long nights. They worked side by side, cared for the children together, and watched the land change. Caleb learned a few words of their language, and they learned more of his. Laughter became part of the house again, soft and natural. Years passed like flowing water. The boy grew into a strong young man who could ride a horse like his father. The girl grew graceful and bright, carrying the warmth of the three women in her smile. The Apache women became more than guests. They became the roots of the ranch. One tended the animals, one cared for the garden, and one watched over the children like her own. One summer day, a stranger came to the valley. He had documents and questions. He asked Caleb why he had done what he did. Caleb looked at the man without flinching. "I didn't buy them," he said quietly. "I gave them a home, and they gave us a life again." The man left with his papers. The ranch stayed the same. Caleb looked at the wide fields, at the horses, at his grown children, and at the three women who now moved around the house with ease and grace. This was not the story people expected. It wasn't about a man buying anyone. It was about people who found each other in a hard world and built something that could not be measured in coins. As the sun set behind the hills that evening, the family gathered on the porch. The air smelled of hay and fresh bread. The children laughed. The women spoke softly in their language, and Caleb leaned back in his chair with quiet eyes. The unexpected ending was simple. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about the past. It was about a house that turned strangers into family. The wind moved gently across the land, carrying the sound of laughter, It was a sound Caleb hadn't heard in years, and for the first time since the fever took his wife, he felt the weight of loneliness lift completely. What began with $6 ended with something far greater: a home. A place where hearts learned to trust again. A place where broken paths met and became one road. Years later, people in town would still tell the story of the quiet rancher and the 3 Apache women. But those who truly knew the truth understood it wasn't a story about buying. It was a story about kindness, survival, and belonging. It was a story about a family that no one expected to exist but became stronger than any whisper could ever break. Caleb sat on the porch that night long after the children had gone to bed. The stars stretched wide above him. He listened to the soft voices inside the house and felt a calm he hadn't known in years. The land was quiet, but it was no longer empty. It had a heartbeat again, and that was all he ever wanted.